Laura Alfaro is the Warren Alpert Professor of Business Administration at the Harvard Business School. She served as Minister of National Planning and Economic Policy in Costa Rica from 2010 to 2012. Welcome, Laura.
Thank you very much for this invitation. It's always a great pleasure to talk to you, and in this particular occasion to talk about Costa Rica.
Costa Rican elections are coming up on February 6th. There are an unprecedented 25 candidates. Can you tell us how this came about? What does it reflect?
So for the longest time, if you want, perhaps since World War II, Costa Rica has been characterized by a big party, the Partido Liberación Nacional, and the opposition to this party, which would take different names until it was consolidated under the PUSC name, Partido Unidad Social Cristiana, and they would alternate power. In the 2000s, there was a split from Partido Liberación Nacional, and the PAC was created. Otón Solís created this party, and again, it was split from this main party. There has always been smaller parties, Partido Comunista, and so on and so forth, but the game has basically been around these three. Eventually, there was also the emergence of religious parties. Evangelical movement is strong in Central America, and it started to get representation. So this is the evolution of these different parties. But right now, I think that 25 parties also reflect a discontent in part related to the COVID pandemic. Unemployment was high, the young are particularly feel disenfranchised, the women are particularly undecided, which is interesting because in Costa Rica, as in many countries, women took a disproportionate amount of the burden of the pandemic for many things. Services that tend to be women jobs in Costa Rica, tourism services were shut down, locked down. And so you see this discontent, the political identities emerged, time to see if there were opportunities or to cave into these concerns that the people have. And thus we have 25 parties. Having said that, I think it's only 5 or 6 that have a real chance of making to a second round, although there's a huge number of undecided, as I mentioned.
Can you tell us about the strongest candidates? Who are they? What do they represent?
As you mentioned, I was a former minister for Partido Liberación Nacional, and so I am biased. And let me just put it out there. I am supporting our candidate. He's ahead on the polls, Figueres. He was a former president in the 90s. I think many in Costa Rica want this knowledgeable executive person who has had experience. I think the last 4 years, one of the big concerns is that the economy and the country seem not to have had a direction. So Figueres is ahead in the polls. He's followed by Lynette Saborío. She was vice president under the PUSC. Costa Rica has already had a woman candidate president, and now we have a former vice president also running. She's also doing relatively well in the polls. The third candidate is, as I mentioned, the evangelical candidate. His name is Fabricio Alvarado. And so these three tend to be the ones ahead. None seem, as of today, to be able to go over the 40% threshold. In Costa Rica, you need to win with at least 40% of the votes. If that doesn't happen in the first round, then we go to a second round. And in the second round is a simple majority of the two main candidates.
So in other words, if people go to the polls on February 6th and nobody gets more than 40%, then you have to have a whole other election with just two candidates.
Yes, so the first election is the first Sunday of February, the second one, the first Sunday of April. In fact, this has already happened in the previous two elections. I think, again, the outcome of this three-way split that we saw in the 2000, it became increasingly hard for parties to get over that 40% threshold. There has been weak candidates for some of the traditional parties. Again, the emergence of now a fourth big, if you want, group. And so the last two elections, we've had to go to the second round.
In Costa Rica, do you have to vote?
No, it's your responsibility, but there's no penalty. It's not compulsory as other countries.
Let me ask you what the rates of abstentionism have been in previous elections and what's expected in this election.
We used to have participation rates of 80%, 90%. I used to be very proud of these numbers. I grew up with the elections being a party. And then slowly that number has gone down. What is expected this time may be close to 67%. It's a tricky number to predict right now because of the pandemic. And it is possible that the process would be a little bit slower. In Costa Rica, you can only vote that day. You have to go and vote. It's a Sunday, and that makes it easier, but there's just one day to vote. And so the COVID crisis may make it a little bit harder to predict if we're going to be around that 65%. It does favor the traditional parties because they do have some electorate that tend to be more loyal. It disproportionately may make young people not vote. So we'll see. But there's an expectation that will be 60+%, which has been in line with the previous elections.
Are Costa Ricans in the United States allowed to vote?
Yes, since the last elections, we have allowed Costa Ricans abroad to vote.
And do they make a significant difference in the elections?
At least the last ones, no, because we don't have a big diaspora compared to other countries.
Throughout Latin America, there's been a tendency to elect outsiders, people sometimes with very little experience. Do you see any signs at all that this might happen in Costa Rica?
I think the current president fits that profile. He was someone relatively young with no executive experience, no private sector experience. He won a little bit of reaction against the Evangelical Party. It was more a vote against the other candidate who made it to the second round, more in favor than in favor. And I think the outcome of that has been seen the last 4 years. Is a very unpopular government. In fact, the candidate of that party has very little support. Having said that, in Costa Rica, we tend not to like to elect the same party twice. So there is also that history. But I would say that already happened. As I mentioned, the three candidates that are ahead in the polls, and again, an election is decided the day of the election, but the three candidates that are ahead are a former president, a former vice president, and the evangelical candidate who has been running for a while now. So there seems to be actually a movement for experience, knowledge, and capacity within your view of what counts as capacity. But again, there's a huge number of undecided voters, and the election will be settled the day is settled.
So Costa Ricans are also going to be voting for legislators. What's the significance of that? So
it is likely that what will happen is what happened in the previous elections. The current president has the least amount of Congress people from his party that we have ever seen. There's even more candidates running for Congress than for president. And this does diminish the capacity to later enact laws and get the country going. That has been one of the issues facing this government. Having said that, I think the opposition was very responsible. And in terms of at least some tax reforms and getting the COVID agenda going, parties came together and passed legislation. But that is always a concern when you don't have majority in Congress.
So what are the main issues in the election?
The main issue is unemployment. The second one, jobs. The third one, unemployment. It has been the topic of the country. There was some slowdown before the pandemic, but Costa Rica was, as Latin America, hardly hit by the pandemic. we're a very small open economy. We depend on trade, we depend on tourism, a lot of those things. Because of the sanitary restrictions, we got less tourists. The country enacted lockdowns early on, and this disproportionately affected services, retail. Lockdowns in Latin America have been a little bit more controversial than in other places because they have not necessarily had the same effect in terms of limiting the spread of the disease. As you know, Latin America has been one of the regions has suffered the most in terms of deaths. But because we have very informal sector, even Costa Rica, 50% of the jobs are in the informal sector, it becomes very hard for the people. If they don't go to work, they just don't make a living. And so they have been very controversial in that sense because they disproportionately affected the economy while reducing a little the spread of the disease. In terms of health, Costa Rica has done relatively well, but again, in a region that has suffered a lot. Vaccinations, early on, there was a contract to get vaccines. And as you know, now Latin America is a leader in vaccination, which may speak a little bit more about the weakness of the US. But that front has been going well, but the economic effects linger. And I think that is what in the minds of most of the electorate. Second, corruption. We have been hit by a series of scandals, a lot of money not always well spent, especially in the transportation sector. And so people also concerns there. But I would say cost of living, employment, jobs, those are the main topics.
So are the platforms of the leading candidates very different in that respect?
I think the main ones, again, Partido Liberación Nacional, PUSC, are putting forward that reactivation, perhaps a little bit more to the right wing, which would be the PUSC, Liberación a little bit more center-left, while the evangelical is using more the cultural concerns to their party, very conservative. And in fact, this is, I think, why the current president won. It was a vote against those type of policies. I would say the majority of the population in Costa Rica tend to be more liberal in their thinking. And so having said that, that evangelical is also very right-wing, liberalization, low taxation, so on and so forth. But most of the platform in the cultural wars, if you want, while the other ones are thinking more about reactivation, how do we deal with poverty, jobs, inequality.
How do you deal with poverty and inequality? What are some of the specific things that people are proposing?
Well, the first thing is we do need to keep the economy open. I think, again, there has been a rethinking of less use, alternative methods, vaccinations, masks, instead of shutting down the economy. Then, as you know, Costa Rica, because we were particularly hit and we already had a very weak fiscal position, we had to go through the IMF. Another part of the agenda is the rethinking the agreement with the IMF in terms of how much we're going to do taxation, how much are we going to increase social spending in the time that is needed. So a lot of the agenda will be focused in the short term of this reactivation, thinking medium-term fiscal sustainability. The other topic that is a little bit more complicated, Costa Rica closed the schools almost 2 years, but the previous 2 years before the lockdowns, there were some massive strikes. So we have 4 years of very uneven education. Some effects are being reflected on PISA exams. We're going down in math and reading. And so there has to be also an agenda of improving education. I do worry that we may end up like in the 80s with another lost generation, another lost decade out of this. Education, this one is always tougher because fixing education always requires sustained medium-term policies, but that is also something that is being discussed.
I know that you call yourself biased, but are the platforms in terms of education very different among the leading candidates?
Yes, because of the evangelical conservatism is very different from the other parties. As I said, in Costa Rica, I think most of the people support same-sex marriage and so on and so forth. And I think they want to move on, but the evangelicals are stuck in that topic. Again, a little bit like in the US when they play the cultural wars. But other than that, it's a focus on we need to improve math, we need to improve science. As you know, Costa Rica has a very good green strategy, And in fact, it was Figueres. And again, if my bias comes out, this is just a fact. The Partido Liberación Nacional has been the party that has enacted the national parks, is the party that created this payment system for reforestation that has been extremely successful. And so at least this party is coming again at the core with the green strategy, trying to create jobs that are within a strategy of being committed and serious about global climate change.
NACLA magazine recently called Costa Rica a country in which democracy is on the brink. Do you agree? Why or why not?
I completely disagree. Just to give you some evidence, Latin Barometro, as you know, has been tracking the views of everyone in Latin America about the role of democracy. Costa Rica continues to be top. We're second only to Uruguay. That's the country, the highest support, then Costa Rica. In the last 2 years, the support for democracy has increased. When you look at the level, it's usually a level that we tend to see when there is a recession. And so there's absolutely nothing out of the ordinary about the level of support now. If anything, has been increasing. We go to the polls, we express, and I think there is at the core, a fundamental respect to the democratic decisions. There might be some frustration about how slow things tend to happen in the country. But again, that is part of the democratic process in Costa Rica. We should work to improve it, but I don't think that anyone would think otherwise.
Do you have any sense of why a reputable magazine like NACLA would even make that statement?
Sell. I wouldn't know. As I said, Latin Barometer is a survey that has been going for years. In fact, 25 candidates reflect that everyone believes that they can be part of the democratic system. And again, it might not necessarily be the optimal number, but everyone thinks they can run for president and they have a possibility to be a president. And there are now 25 choices. As I said, it does reflect that people are going through very tough times, and there is different concerns and different political identities trying to cater or express those different concerns.
My next question might seem like it's a repetition of my former question. And when I asked you about the issues that the candidates were campaigning on, but this is actually about what happens when a president gets into government and faces different kinds of obstacles. I want to put on your hat as a former minister and think about what the most important challenges a new president would face in making things happen and getting policies through.
As I said, I think this is why Costa Rica is turning to experienced leaders, because I think the last 2 years we have seen what happens when day one, the president sort of needs to figure out how things work. We would have in the two main parties people who know how things work. And in particular, in the case of Figueres, and again, I express my political affiliation, is someone who's known to be very executive. And so he gets the team, he organizes, he gets things done. In a country like Costa Rica, where we like to discuss things, it's important to be a little bit more executive in terms of, okay, so we decided, we agree, and now we moved on. As I said, that those first days will be days of thinking the engagement with the IMF. We have an agreement. IMF knows how Costa Rica works. There's an election and they're given the space for that election. But once it happens, they're going to have to sit down and think of the next steps in terms of medium-term sustainability. So one team is probably going to be about that. And the other team is about getting the economy going again. The recent numbers are better. Again, tourism is coming back, the economy is bouncing back, and so those are good numbers, but we need to do more to turn those numbers into employment, and especially female employment. Disproportionately, women lost jobs. Unemployment at one point, female unemployment was close to 36%. And that, again, goes in hand of making sure kids go to school, and so the parents can go to work. And so it does include a series of policies. But I think the teams are thinking about how to do that in an inclusive way.
Many people say that Costa Rica is different from other Central American and even other Latin American countries Do you believe that's true? And how would you explain this difference?
I think it is true in terms of not only the commitment to democracy, but I also think the fact that we have no army has made a difference. I do think it's just a different way of approaching the world where you don't have an army. And as I said, those tend to be core values in Costa Rica. Everyone is proud that we have no army. And in general of the democratic process, despite the fact that sometimes we feel it doesn't execute. Again, the situation right now has changed because of the pandemic, but I think the democracy and the stability has brought opportunities to many. And that's what we need to remind the people, that democracy, stable institutions are way to develop and grow. The only thing that I think we're very proud is the accomplishments in terms of the fight against climate change. I think in Costa Rica, we're proud green people, now with a very long history of protecting the environment in many ways. And I think that also differentiates us. The good thing is I think everyone is catching on to that, but we were green before many were green.
Costa Rica is in the middle of a very explosive and conflict-ridden region. Do you think the elections are going to make any difference in the way that it handles its policies towards other Central American countries?
I think the major parties have all voiced their strong opposition about what's going on in Nicaragua. And so I don't see a change in that. Parties that are in favor of dictatorship, I don't think have a chance of winning the election. And there is one in particular that has been very pro-dictatorship, but as I said, I just don't see a possibility of winning an election in Costa Rica. Costa Rica has voiced this opposition, and I think the people also have voiced the opposition. We have always seen the negative effects of these dictatorships in the region, migration, poverty. And so you ask why we were so committed in favor of democracy, because we have the constant example of what happens when you deviate. And in terms of economic and social outcomes, the difference is sadly huge.
You mentioned migration. Do the leading candidates have different positions on that issue as people come from Central America?
As you know, in Costa Rica, we have a policy that anyone who comes can use the public services. I'm not saying that the quality of the public services is great, but for the most part, they can be used. And so the main parties are in favor of that. Again, there might be some more anti-migration, but I just don't see it in the main candidates per se as being against the people who need help. Is that we are all having a tough time, and so we're trying also with the limited resources that we have to try to help everyone. But it is important that international organizations do help in terms of these migrations from the region. There is in the US a lot of discussion about when they go to the north, the migrants, but there's very little discussion when they go south. And we do have receive a lot, again, in a time where we're all having difficult times because of the pandemic.
We've just spent a half an hour talking about the election on February 6th, but why should people in the United States and other countries even care?
So recently, Costa Rica, Panama, and Dominican Republic created an alliance for desarrollo en democracia, development under democracy. And President Biden hailed this alliance, and he said that at this moment where countries in the region, particularly in Central America, are turning their backs to democracy, it becomes imperative that we can continue to show that democracies can deliver for people on the issues that matter the most to them. So I think for the US, where we share the value and the respect for democracy, freedom, I do think there's also a moral duty to help countries that share those values. And I do think in Costa Rica, we have shown that it is the way to improve the lives of people. I have to say that I have been very lucky. I have had a lot of opportunities. But a lot of those opportunities have been forged in a country that had had this stability, this democracy. My grandparents, again, didn't have the opportunity to study. It's beginning of the century, but my parents did. They all went to public universities that were created in this democratic system of social inclusion. And because of that, I had a different set of opportunities. I was able to come and study in the US with a scholarship. My parents would never have been able to pay for that. But again, all of these forged stability, education, public goods. And that is what we should continue to show that it can be done. And because of that, I think the US also has a moral duty to help the countries that manage to create this prosperity under democracy.
Thank you. Is there anything else you would like to add?
I do hope everyone goes to vote. It's a privilege, and so hopefully we'll get a candidate in the first round. I think it will help us sort things faster, but if not, well, there will be the second round. But it is important to exercise our rights.
You've been listening to Laura Alfaro. She is the Warren Alpert Professor of Business Administration at the Harvard Business School. She served as Minister of National Planning and Economic Policy in Costa Rica from 2010 to 2012. Thank you so much for being with us.